Oh, Dutton, I have a long criminal record.
You're in trouble. This machine has a long memory.
Yes! I'm turning off the oxygen. Breathe fast and hard.
No, Jeremy, don't let him cut off my oxygen.
There are now 25 seconds to self-destruct. 9. Self-destruct has been canceled.
In the darkness of space, a satellite falls to Earth. Within hours, nearly an entire town lies dead, their blood turned to powder. This is how the Andromeda Strain begins. Not with aliens wielding ray guns, but with microscopic terror that defies understanding. Released in 1971, Robert Wise's clinical thriller arrived at the perfect cultural moment, when America's fascination with space exploration collided head-on with Cold War paranoia about biological warfare. Based on Michael Crichton's best-selling novel, The Andromeda Strain represented something new in science fiction cinema. Universal Pictures invested $6.5 million in the production, a substantial sum for the time, and saw returns of approximately $12.3 million at the box office. While not a blockbuster by today's standards, the film's meticulous attention to scientific detail and procedural realism established it as something far more important than a commercial success. What makes The Andromeda Strain so compelling isn't explosions or monster attacks, but the terrifying plausibility of its premise. This film pioneered what we might call the realistic science fiction thriller, a subgenre that treats scientific process with respect, while acknowledging how quickly our technological reach can exceed our ethical grasp. 4 decades before films like Contagion would terrify audiences with pandemic scenarios, The Andromeda Strain established the template with clinical precision. In an era when science fiction often meant rubber monsters or psychedelic space adventures, The Andromeda Strain dared to suggest that the most frightening threats might be invisible to the naked eye, and that our best defense would not be laser guns, but laboratories, microscopes, and the scientific method itself. As we'll explore, this approach didn't just create a compelling thriller, it forever changed how cinema portrays the intersection of science and existential threat. The slow-motion ballet of scientists passing through the 5-level decontamination chamber, the pulsing red emergency lights as the wildfire facility enters lockdown, the unforgettable split-screen sequence tracking the team's progress as they descend deeper into the underground laboratory. These scenes from The Andromeda Strain showcase director Robert Wise's extraordinary technical precision, a filmmaker who approached science fiction with the eye of a documentarian. What makes The Andromeda Strain revolutionary is its commitment to visual authenticity. Fresh from directing The Sound of Music and West Side Story, Wise applied his meticulous eye to creating what feels like a military medical documentary rather than Hollywood fiction. The film employed revolutionary split-screen techniques, showing multiple camera angles simultaneously to convey the complex, parallel scientific processes taking place. This wasn't just stylistic flourish, it mimicked the way scientists must track multiple variables simultaneously, bringing viewers into the methodical world of scientific investigation. The production design by Boris Levin created the remarkable multi-level wildfire facility, a self-contained underground laboratory with increasing levels of sterilization and security. Each level, distinguished by its own color scheme, became progressively more sterile, with Level 5 being the most secure environment ever depicted on film at that time. The laboratory equipment wasn't mere set dressing, but functional-looking technology that scientists of the era would recognize. Wise insisted on this authenticity, consulting with NASA engineers and medical professionals to ensure every petri dish, microscope, and computer terminal looked genuinely operational. Speaking of computers, the film's depiction of technology deserves special mention. Special effects, wizard Douglas Trumbull, who had just finished work on 2001: A Space Odyssey, created computer interface visuals that were revolutionary for 1971. The oscillating patterns digital readouts, and primitive graphics established a visual language for how computers would be portrayed in films for decades. When we see a character interact with a computer screen in modern movies, we're witnessing the design language pioneered by the Andromeda Strain. The film's sound design creates an atmosphere of clinical tension through its electronic score and precise audio effects. Rather than relying on traditional orchestral cues to tell audiences when to feel afraid, Wise uses the beeping of monitors, the hiss of airlocks, and the mechanical hum of equipment to build tension. The absence of conventional music during key scientific sequences emphasizes the documentary-like approach, making viewers feel like observers in a real crisis rather than an audience watching fiction. Perhaps the most significant technical achievement was the film's balanced approach to scientific language. The screenplay incorporated authentic medical and biological terminology without alienating general audiences. Each technical term is carefully explained through natural dialogue or visual demonstration, creating a film that feels intellectually stimulating rather than condescending. This approach to scientific accuracy would influence generations of filmmakers, from James Cameron to Steven Soderbergh. The image of Dr. Mark Hall racing against time to insert a slip of paper into the self-destruct override system as nuclear countdown begins. Dr. Ruth Leavitt collapsing during a crucial microscope session, her undisclosed epilepsy endangering the entire operation. The haunting moment when Dr. Jeremy Stone realizes the organism is mutating in response to their very efforts to destroy it. These pivotal scenes from the Andromeda Strain demonstrate how the film's performances elevate what could have been a dry scientific procedural into a tense human drama. Unlike most science fiction films of its era, the Andromeda Strain deliberately avoided casting Hollywood stars. Instead, director Robert Wise assembled a team of character actors who could convincingly portray scientific intelligence. Arthur Hill brings a thoughtful gravitas to Dr. Jeremy Stone, the team's leader whose measured approach masks an intense determination. Hill's performance is remarkable for what it doesn't do. He never resorts to scenery chewing or dramatic outbursts. Instead, his deliberate speech patterns and careful movements convey a man whose mind is constantly calculating possibilities while maintaining the calm exterior needed to lead in crisis. James Olsen portrays Dr. Mark Hall, the surgeon whose bachelor status makes him the designated odd man out, the only person able to deactivate the nuclear self-destruct mechanism. Olsen's performance subtly tracks the psychological weight of this responsibility. His character represents the human connection in the sterile environment, as we see when he forms a bond with the infant survivor from Piedmont. The film's climactic sequence, with Hall navigating Wildfire's ventilation system to reach the deactivation station while fighting the effects of electrical shock, remains one of cinema's most intellectually thrilling action sequences. Perhaps the most memorable performance comes from Kate Reid as Dr. Ruth Leavitt, the abrasive, no-nonsense microbiologist whose skepticism provides a crucial counterbalance to the team's methodical approach. Reid's portrayal was groundbreaking in 1971. A female scientist characterized not by glamour, but by intellectual rigor and professional respect. Her concealment of her epilepsy creates one of the film's most powerful tensions, and Reid brilliantly conveys both Leavitt's scientific brilliance and her human flaws. What makes these performances particularly effective is how they serve the film's larger themes about the scientific process itself. The clash between methodical research and urgent crisis creates the central tension, with each character representing different aspects of the scientific mindset. Stone embodies careful protocol, Hall represents humanitarian concerns, Leavitt brings necessary skepticism, and Dr. Charles Dutton, portrayed by David Wayne, offers experienced perspective. The casting process itself reveals Wise's commitment to authenticity. Rather than seeking actors who could simply memorize scientific terminology, he sought performers who could convey the thought processes behind the words. This approach created a film where intelligence itself becomes dramatic, where the act of thinking, analyzing, and problem-solving generates as much tension as any physical threat. By focusing on the intellectual challenge rather than melodramatic character conflicts, the Andromeda Strain created a new template for how science could be portrayed in popular entertainment. The scene where scientists discover the Andromeda organism feeds directly on energy, making conventional sterilization methods useless. The stunning moment of realization that the pathogen has evolved to break down synthetic materials, threatening a catastrophic breach of containment. The visual reveal of Piedmont's affected citizens frozen in place, dead within seconds of exposure. These unforgettable sequences from the Andromeda Strain demonstrate why the film's reception has evolved from respectful admiration to recognition as a genuine classic. When the Andromeda Strain premiered in 1971, critical response was notably divided. Major publications praised its scientific authenticity and technical precision. The New York Times called it a splendid entertainment that moves with skill and intelligence. However, some critics found its clinical approach and deliberate pacing problematic. Variety, while acknowledging the EI film's production values, complained about an overlong 130 minutes of screen time and suggested the film was technically and artistically sterile. What's fascinating is how this perceived weakness, the film's clinical, documentary-like approach, has transformed into its greatest strength over time. As audiences grew more scientifically literate and pandemic threats became more prominent in public consciousness, the film's meticulous realism gained appreciation. By the 1990s, scientific consultants and virologists were regularly citing the Andromeda Strain as the rare Hollywood production that got the science mostly right. Perhaps the most controversial element of the film in 1971 was its unflinching depiction of mass death without emotional manipulation. The scenes in Piedmont, with victims dead in mid-motion, presented mortality as a scientific fact rather than an opportunity for melodrama. This approach was unsettling to audiences accustomed to more conventional treatments of tragedy. But modern viewers, raised on documentaries about real-world outbreaks, recognize this restraint as powerful storytelling. What many viewers missed in early viewings were the fascinating details embedded throughout the production. The wildfire installation was designed with input from actual NASA facility engineers. The computer interfaces, while necessarily simplified for visual impact, were based on real-time computing capabilities of the period. Most impressively, the central premise of an extraterrestrial microorganism was vetted by astrobiologists who considered such contamination a legitimate scientific concern during the early space program, the reason behind actual quarantine protocols for returning astronauts during the Apollo era. The film's 2008 television miniseries remake provides an interesting point of comparison. Where the original maintained clinical detachment, the remake added emotional subplots, conspiracy elements, and more conventional thriller components. Its mixed reception highlighted why the original's stripped-down approach remains so effective. By removing conventional dramatic tropes, the original film forces viewers to engage intellectually rather than emotionally, creating tension through ideas rather than manipulated empathy. One remarkable aspect of the Andromeda Strain is how well its special effects have aged compared to its contemporaries. By focusing on microscopic threats rather than spaceships or monsters, the film avoided the dated visual effects that plague many science fiction films of its era. The microscopy sequences, showing the crystalline structure of the Andromeda organism, remain convincing even to modern audiences familiar with actual electron microscope imagery. The solemn final voiceover. The Andromeda Strain was the first crisis to require the activation of wildfire by the authority of the President of the United States. The full details have never been released. The chilling satellite monitoring program set up to detect any recurrence. The scientists' quietly haunted expressions as they realize how close humanity came to extinction through sheer chance. These closing moments of the Andromeda Strain reveal why, over 50 years later, this film continues to resonate with frightening relevance. The direct cinematic descendants of the Andromeda Strain are numerous and significant. Wolfgang Petersen's 1995 film Outbreak borrowed many visual and narrative elements, particularly the clinical approach to containment protocols and the race against biological contamination. Steven Soderbergh's 2011 film Contagion feels spiritually connected to Wise's approach, adopting a similar documentary-like style and commitment to scientific accuracy. The National Geographic series The Hot Zone follows directly in the tradition established by the Andromeda Strain, focusing on procedure and scientific process rather than action set pieces. But perhaps the most profound impact of the Andromeda Strain isn't on fiction, but on how we understand real-world threats. The COVID-19 pandemic brought the film's central concerns into sharp focus, making its depiction of containment protocols, scientific investigation, and institutional response feel less like science fiction and more like prophecy. Scenes of scientists in hazmat suits, debates about quarantine procedures, and discussions of mutation rates now play like documentary footage rather than speculation. Michael Crichton, who wrote the original novel while attending Harvard Medical School, established a template for science-based thrillers that would influence not just cinema, but public understanding of scientific risk. From Jurassic Park to countless pandemic thrillers, the notion that humanity's greatest threats might come from our interaction with biological systems traces directly back to the Andromeda Strain. What makes the film particularly relevant today is its central warning about scientific hubris. The Andromeda organism arrives on Earth via a satellite specifically designed to capture extraterrestrial microorganisms for potential weapons research. This theme, that our technological reach exceeds our ethical grasp, resonates powerfully in an era of gain-of-function research, artificial intelligence, and genetic engineering. The film's scientists are heroes, not because they're infallible, but because they recognize their limitations and proceed with appropriate caution. The film's visual language has become part of our cultural vocabulary. When news programs show split-screen images of scientists working in high-containment laboratories, they're drawing on the visual grammar established by the Andromeda Strain. When pandemic reports focus on the methodical process of tracking mutations and transmission vectors, they're following the narrative approach pioneered by Wise's film. As we face a future where pandemics, climate change, and technological risks pose increasing threats, the Andromeda Strain offers a valuable perspective. It suggests that our survival depends not on heroic individuals, but on methodical systems, careful science, and institutional knowledge. In an era when scientific expertise is often questioned, the film's respect for the scientific process feels both refreshing and necessary. What makes the Andromeda Strain truly timeless is its recognition that the most frightening threats aren't monsters or aliens, but the invisible, microscopic dangers we barely understand. As we develop more powerful technologies and explore new frontiers, what other Andromeda Strains might we encounter? What invisible threats are we bringing into existence through our own scientific advancement? The questions posed by this remarkable film in 1971 remain unanswered and more urgent than ever. If you've enjoyed this analysis of how the Andromeda Strain changed science fiction cinema and continues to inform our understanding of biological threats, consider subscribing for more explorations of influential science fiction films. What scientific concerns do you think today's filmmakers should be addressing? The conversation that began with the Andromeda Strain continues, and in a world of emerging pandemics and technological risks, we need cinema that makes us think now more than ever.